Hydrogen sulfide exposure control. Purpose. The purpose of this program is to reduce employee hydrogen sulfide H2S exposure to below the permissible exposure limits by means of engineering and work practice controls at Plaas Incorporated. This program meets the requirements of OSHA Standard 29 CFR 1910.1000 Table Z through 2. Definitions. Acceptable sealing concentration. Airborne concentration that should not be exceeded at any time during an 8-hour shift. Acceptable maximum peak concentration. The maximum airborne concentration allowed over a short time period if there is no other measurable exposure over any 8-hour shift. Container. Any barrel, bottles, can, cylinder, drum, reaction vessels, storage tank, or the like, but does not include piping systems. Emergency. Any occurrence such as equipment failure, rupture of containers, or failure to control equipment that may or does result in an unexpected significant release of hydrogen sulfide. Employee exposure. Exposure to airborne hydrogen sulfide that would occur if the employee were not using respiratory protective equipment. Permissible exposure limit. PEL. The OSHA limit for exposure to airborne hazards. For benzene, the limits are 10 ppm TWA, 15 ppm STEL 20 ppm acceptable ceiling, and 50 ppm acceptable maximum peak. Above ceiling once for 10 minutes if no other exposure occurs. Route of exposure. The route by which the air contaminants enter the body. Exposure routes include inhalation, ingestion, or skin absorption. Short-term exposure limit STEL. Airborne concentration measured over any 15-minute time period. Time-weighted average, TWA. Airborne concentration averaged over an 8-hour time period. Responsibilities. The program administrator will issue and implement this program and ensure that it meets applicable requirements. Issue and implement the Plaas Incorporated Confined Space Entry Program according to OSHA CFR 29-1910.146. Provide hazard communication training for hydrogen sulfide. Implement engineering and work practice controls to prevent exposure to hydrogen sulfide. Provide appropriate personal protective equipment for exposed employees. Maintain exposure monitoring records according to the record-keeping section of this program. Managers and supervisors will know and understand the hazards of hydrogen sulfide exposure. Comply with the Plaas Incorporated Confined Space Entry Program. Comply with all engineering and work practice controls in place to prevent hydrogen sulfide exposure. Ensure the availability and use of appropriate personal protective equipment for exposed employees. Employees will comply with all aspects of this hydrogen sulfide exposure control program, comply with the Plaas Incorporated Confined Space Entry Program. Attend scheduled hazard communication training and confined space entry training. Use engineering and work practice controls in place to prevent hydrogen sulfide exposure. Use personal protective equipment as necessary to prevent hydrogen sulfide exposure. Program activities. Hazard recognition. Plaas Incorporated works to ensure that employees are not exposed to hydrogen sulfide above OSHA exposure limits at any time. Hydrogen sulfide, or H2S, is a colorless, flammable gas that has a distinctive rotten egg odor. It is also referred to as dihydrogen sulfide, sulfur hydride, sewer gas, and stink damp. The physical characteristics of hydrogen sulfide are: hydrogen sulfide is produced naturally by decaying organic matter released from liquid manure and natural gas, a byproduct of industrial processes including petroleum refining, mining, tanning, wood pulp processing, and used to produce elemental sulfur, sulfuric acid, heavy water for nuclear reactors. Hydrogen sulfide exposure could occur as a result of the following processes: drilling operations, recycling drilling mud, contact from water from crude wells, blowouts, tank gouging, routine maintenance at refining operations. Confined space entry, refer to Plaas Incorporated Confined Space Entry Program. Exposure to hydrogen sulfide above published limits can result in adverse health effects, including eye irritation, lung effects, central nervous system effects on parts of the brain that control breathing, shock, convulsions, and death at high exposures. Symptoms of hydrogen sulfide exposure include eye irritation, nose and throat irritation, headache and dizziness, nausea, cough, and breathing difficulty. Hazard evaluation, monitoring. Monitoring for airborne concentrations of hydrogen sulfide at Plaas Incorporated work sites is conducted using a 4-gas meter and accomplished using the procedures detailed in the Confined Space Entry Program. Area 4 gas monitors will be set to alarm when airborne hydrogen sulfide concentrations exceed the OSHA STL limit of 20 ppm. Hazard control. Plaas Incorporated employees will not work in areas with airborne concentrations above OSHA permissible exposure limits. If circumstances require an exception to the above, NIOSH approved self-contained breathing apparatus or air-supplied respirators will be used. In confined spaces, hydrogen sulfide hazards will be controlled in accordance with the Plaas Incorporated Confined Space Entry Program. Controls include, but are not limited to, dilution ventilation, forced air ventilation, and the use of NIOSH-approved respiratory protection, scuba and air supplied only. Other safety precautions include, whenever the 4 gas monitor alarms leave the area immediately to fresh air and do not re-enter until conditions are proven safe or appropriate respiratory protection is donned. Upon commencing operations at a work site, obtain, know, and understand the facility's contingency plan. Training. Plaas Incorporated employees will be trained in the hazards and safe control of hydrogen sulfide exposure using the training materials included in this program. Training is documented according to the record-keeping section of the program as well as the record-keeping section of the Hazard Communication Program and Confined Space Entry programs. Plaas Incorporated employees will be trained for safe confined space entry according to the implemented Confined Space Entry program.